In a lot of Fire Emblem games, outside of weather effects and desert terrain, it doesn't make a difference what type of map you're on. All of your units work the same from one map to another map. But in some games, particularly a couple older ones, your units are a bit more polite and realize that it would be inappropriate to ride a horse in a house. And so they are forced to dismount, becoming infantry units until you get back to an outdoor map. The first game that implemented this feature was Fire Emblem 3, and it's pretty noticeable right away. Mostly going to talk about FE3 Book 1 here because it's the route of FE3 that I'm most familiar with. You start off Book 1 with 4 mounted units, all of whom can choose to dismount at any time. And you might be thinking, well, why would I want to get them off their horse? And there are a couple reasons. The big one is that in indoor maps, you just have to get off your horse. But the second reason is that what weapons a unit can use change depending on whether they are mounted or unmounted. For example, you'll quickly notice that your 2 cavaliers, Cain and Abel, each start with a sword in their inventory that they don't appear to be able to use. But they can if you dismount them. If you're more familiar with modern Fire Emblem games, the idea of getting off a horse to get access to swords probably doesn't sound that appealing. After all, lances are often better than swords. But with the way that weapon weight works in FE3, it's pretty frequent that your cavaliers can't double with lances but can double with swords. So sometimes, especially in the early game, it's worth hopping off your horse so that you can double an enemy using a sword. You want to be a little careful doing this with Jagen though, as promoted mounted units like paladins gain stats when they mount and lose them when they dismount. This has a few implications. First, this confirms that cavalier promotion gains are stored in the horse. Second, it means that later in the game you won't want to dismount as often. Early in the game, Cain, Abel, and your other cavaliers can hop off their mount to use a sword at no penalty, beyond that they lose some move. But later in the game, once they promote, that won't be true anymore. Plus, they'll have gained some stats and will have an easier time doubling enemies with lances than they did in the early game, so there's even less incentive to get off your horse. The last effect that promoted units losing stats on dismounting has is that foot units get a great opportunity to shine on indoor maps where paladins are required to dismount. On these maps, infantry units like Agma and Tomas get to enjoy their promotion bonuses from Sniper and Hero, but your paladins and flyers do not get to enjoy theirs. Infantry units being good on indoor maps has a pretty cool effect on the game because it means there's actually a good reason to use them even on outdoor maps. When I play FE3 Book 1, it's really nice having a promoted Agma around for Chapter 10, as it's a big indoor map, so your cavaliers are force dismounted. Not only will Agma have more move than your dismounted horses, he will also likely be your best cavalier, because your paladins and Minerva will be suffering lower stats than they're used to, while Agma will be as strong as he usually is. But in order to have Agma promoted for this map, you're gonna have to make use of him on the preceding outdoor map so that you can level him up to promotion. So having these indoor maps where Agma shines doesn't just give low infantry units a good map, it also gives you a good reason to make use of them and train them on outdoor maps, because you know the indoors are coming up where you're going to be glad to have a good infantry unit. Even the last map of FE3 Book 1 is an indoor map, which adds just a little bit more reason to use infantry units. Dismounted cavaliers and flyers can only use swords, which means if you want to use powerful 1-2 ranged weapons like the Gradius indoors, you'll have to turn to your infantry units. This can give unmounted units some interesting niches like Tomas and Lorenz being decent choices to fight the final boss, because they can hold the Gradius and Parthia indoors, giving them the luxury of being able to hit Medius at 2 range. This wouldn't have worked in FE1, where Medius is immune to 2 range attacks, but it does work in FE3. A funny quirk about FE3 is that the way that indoor and outdoor maps work is just entirely based on the map you're on rather than where your unit is standing. So in something like Chapter 8, even though the center of the map is a building, you don't have to dismount to go inside the building. In contrast, Chapter 5 has a section of the map that I believe is supposed to be outdoors, or at least it's clearly outdoors in Shadow Dragon. On this map, you have to be dismounted at all times, even if you're in the outdoors portion of the map. I generally like this system in FE3. I enjoy the dynamic in the early game where you choose between being mounted or doubling, and I like that indoor maps give infantry units an opportunity to shine and incentivizes you to train your infantry units during the outdoor maps. Importantly, the indoor-outdoor system largely accomplishes this without making your invested mounted units feel useless. Cain and Abel will still be able to contribute on indoor maps, they just won't dominate like they do on outdoor maps. My only real complaint about this system is that I wish mounted units were a little more varied when dismounted. As it stands, all your cavaliers and flyers become sword-locked when they're forced to dismount, with the exception of bow knights who use bows when dismounted. I think it would be fun for the weapon types to be a bit more varied. Maybe one of your cavs could use an axe when dismounted, and another could use lances or bows. This would help differentiate your cavs a bit more during the indoor maps, which would be a plus in my view. Another thing that helps dismounting work well in FE3 is that units don't have individual weapon ranks, but instead have a universal weapon level that applies to every weapon type they can wield. So when your cav is forced to dismount, they aren't stuck on iron swords. Instead, they will be able to use an arsenal of swords of a similar quality to the lances they could use while mounted. This changed a bit in the next game with indoor-outdoor restrictions, Fire Emblem Thracia 776. Like FE3, in FE5 you can dismount at any time, but unlike FE3, whether you are indoors or outdoors is actually determined by where your unit is standing. In FE3, some maps were designated as indoors and forced dismounting, while others were designated as outdoors and didn't. But in FE5, if you're on an outdoor map with a building on it, your mounted unit can be mounted while they're outside, but they need to dismount in order to walk into the building. Unlike FE3, in FE5 there's not much incentive to dismount if you don't have to, and there's a few reasons for that. Like FE3, dismounting in FE5 changes the weapon type that you can use, but FE5 has weapon ranks for each weapon type, so if you take a unit like Finn, he starts with a good lance rank, and when he's mounted he uses lances, and when he's dismounted he uses swords. But since he spends most of his time mounted, his sword rank is usually much lower than his lance rank. So even in scenarios where using a sword might be preferable to a lance, it's usually not worth him giving up his high rank lances like the Brave or Killer Lance in exchange for using an iron sword. Finn joins early in the game, so he has more opportunities than most to grind up that sword rank if you want to make use of him in indoor maps, but particularly for later joining mounted units, their sword rank is often pretty hard to work with. Not to mention, this game also added a build stat to offset weight. In FE3, lances are heavy, and that can make them difficult to double with, so sometimes, especially in the early game, you dismount your cavalier so that they can use a lighter sword and double. But in Thracia, that's not needed as often. You can double with lances and axes earlier and more easily, so you don't often need to get off your horse to double. You also lose stats from dismounting in this game like you did in FE3, except in this game you lose stats even when unpromoted. So there are a lot of reasons not to get off of your horse in FE5, but sometimes you have to. Some maps take place completely indoors, while other maps have indoor portions that you need to send units to. Like FE3, I like how this gives your infantry units opportunities to shine. It creates a dynamic where on indoor maps, units like Dagdar and Ocean are going to dominate, while outdoor maps are more focused on your mounted units, both for their improved combat and mobility, as well as their ability to rescue drop your infantry units. Mounting being stronger than dismounting also allows Thracia to create a cool moment early in the game. During the Manster arc early in the game, you play a few indoor maps in a row and recruit multiple mounted units along the way that are forced dismounted. When you escape captivity and finally get outside, everybody gets to hop on their mount, getting higher move and increased stats. It's a cool moment that rewards you for making it through a few difficult chapters in a row, and a big part of why it works so well is the forced dismounting. The dismounting in indoors-outdoors system also plays well with FE5's stamina system. In Thracia, as you use units, they build up fatigue, and when it gets too high, you need to sit them out for a map to reset the fatigue. Alternatively, you can give them an SP drink, but at certain points during a playthrough or on your first playthrough, you may not have a ton of SP drinks. As a result, sometimes you want to bench a unit to fix their stamina up so that you can use them for the next couple maps. Indoor and outdoor maps provide a great opportunity to give certain units a rest. If you're on a huge outdoor map, that might be a good time to give Dagdar a rest, or if you're on an indoor map, you can give Finn and his horse a break. This can make your indoor teams feel a little different than your outdoor teams, though there's still going to be some overlap, but I like how the stamina and indoor-outdoor maps combine to add some extra decision-making when you're doing your deployment. The last cool thing about FE5 dismounting is that having weapon ranks and leadership stars meant that you could give certain mounted units features to make them more useful indoors than others, and this is an interesting balancing lever among mounted units. For example, Hicks starts with E-rank swords and no leadership stars, so it's a tough sell to bring him to an indoor map if you have other choices. In contrast, our Wyvern Dean comes with A-rank swords, so if you ever bring him to an indoor map, he can actually put in some work as he can use any number of excellent swords. Another unit, Glade, is stuck on E-rank swords to begin with, but he comes with a leadership star, so just by existing, he gives everyone additional hit and evasion. This can make him an okay choice for indoor maps if you're just looking for a random filler unit to add to the team. So unlike FE3, you usually don't want to dismount in FE5, but like FE3, you're going to have to on indoor maps. This combined with the stamina system influences how you choose to do your deployment, so there's good reason to make use of infantry and mounted units in Thracia, and indoor relevant stats like sword weapon rank and leadership stars become ways to differentiate mounted units even in the same class. These are the only two games with forced dismounting, so it's something that Fire Emblem doesn't do often and has moved away from, but I actually really like the effect that it has on the game. I sort of see these indoor maps as doing what desert maps are trying to do, except forced dismounting does it better. Desert maps, in theory, penalize mounted units and give mages and foot units an opportunity to perform well, but in practice, flyers tend to dominate these maps, and there's also usually only 1 or 2 desert maps per game, so they aren't prevalent enough that you want to train different units just to have an easier time on the desert maps most of the time. Indoor maps do this better. Since flyers also have to dismount here, your infantry units really get to be the star of the show on these indoor maps. And there are enough indoor maps that you want to be using some infantry units to make them easier. So I actually really like this system, and I wouldn't mind seeing it again in a new game, though I would like to see more varied weapon options for dismounted units. Forced indoor dismounting may not appear in another Fire Emblem game, but we do see optional dismounting in a few other Fire Emblem games. One that might surprise you is Fire Emblem 4, and I wouldn't blame anyone for forgetting that that game has dismounting, because most units can't do it. In fact, only Seliph can dismount in FE4. When he does so, he loses some stats, 3 points of move, and the ability to use lances. As far as I can tell, there is no mechanical benefit to dismounting. You wouldn't even do it to avoid damage from a Rider's Bane because Seliph's Nihil skill negates effective damage anyway. So you might be wondering why they bothered putting this in the game, and just for Seliph at that. Well, we may have an answer from the devs on that according to Serenus Forest. This is from a translated Q&A published in the FE4 Player's Guide. I can't read the original text, so I'm trusting that Serenus Forest has a correct translation. Please take this with the appropriate grain of salt as I cannot translate it myself. I'll link the source in the video description so you can check it out and confirm. When asked if Seliph being able to dismount had any special meaning, the answer given was that when developing the game, they thought that women fans would see a unit like Leaf, think he's handsome, and might not want to promote him and put him on a horse. So to solve this, every mounted unit was going to be able to dismount, much like in FE3. But due to space limitations, this was changed to a just Seliph feature. Assuming that the translation is correct, it's a pretty weird reason to include dismounting, particularly for just one unit. So FE4 technically has dismounting, but most people will probably never use it, and there's really no reason to unless you just like the aesthetic of dismounted Seliph. After FE5, we don't see dismounting again until 3 houses. In this game, dismounting is never forced, and it's usually beneficial to stay on your mount. But something unique about dismounting in 3 houses is the way that mounted stat adjustments work. In FE3 through 5, you are always as good or better stats-wise when mounted compared to dismounted. In 3 houses, this is true for some classes. Wyverns, for example, are always better mounted than dismounted, but other classes like Paladins can lose stats when they mount. Paladins lose speed when they mount and they gain it back when they dismount, so there could be some niche situations where you want to hop off your horse for a couple extra points of speed. For flyers, hopping off could occasionally be useful for avoiding an archer, but my experience with 3 houses is that regardless of your class, you want to stay on your mount the vast majority of the time. That's the last of the traditional Fire Emblem games with dismounting. We did also see it in 3 Hopes. In 3 Hopes, mounted units can dismount and it completely changes their moveset. I kind of like this because it gives you multiple options for how to play a character, and it also allows me to travel quickly from location to location, and then once I get where I'm going, I can use the unmounted moveset if I prefer it, and that's nice. So that's every instance of dismounting and indoor-outdoor mechanics in the series. It's something that Fire Emblem has done pretty infrequently, and forced dismounting in particular hasn't happened in over a couple decades. I would definitely be interested in seeing it again. It wouldn't work in every game. In games where reclassing is free or low cost, like Shadow Dragon, if you didn't want a unit to force dismount, you could just slide them over to a promoted infantry class and not worry about it. But in games where reclassing isn't as readily available, I think it would be a cool way to let different units stand out on different maps. So it's something I would like to see the series experiment with again at some point. But what do you think? Is dismounting something that could come back, or would you rather it stay gone? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. If you liked the video, consider hitting the like and subscribe button so that you never miss an upload. And if you want to chat more, consider checking out the community Discord that you'll find linked in the video description. As always, a big thank you to my geckos on Patreon, and a shout out to my skinks Red Mage Morgan, Chicken, Morgwolf, Upscale Furry Trash, Cosplay Sylveon, Emma, Van West, Ikepoo, Lucy Sev, Romeo, Wingman, Lonely Voxel, Aaron Gedden, Mikabre, Stars to Art, Doopy, and the Noodle Doodler. I really appreciate all of your support, and if you want to support the channel and get shoutouts in videos like this, you'll find a link in the video description. Either way, thanks for hanging out, and have yourself a lovely week.